For the very kind introduction, and also thank you for the invitation to speak here today. The title for my talk will be The Financial Crisis Related to Green Tax Shifting in Europe. But I'll try first to relate to some global developments, because I think that they are kind of underestimated in this debate on the financial crisis. And actually the photograph you see here, as you may reckon, it's not exactly a European city. It's one of these Chinese cities that are growing up these years. Actually, this is a place that I visited myself in China 20 years ago. It's not Beijing, it's not Shanghai, it's just one of these small places which now has turned into a big urban agglomeration. Before I say a few words there about these global developments, let me just briefly present the European Environment Agency. We're a European institution covering the member states of the European Union, but also a number of additional countries, including Norway, Switzerland, Turkey, and also with candidate countries in the Balkan states. So we are an example that European cooperation takes place in a house with many different rooms, and in this room we're very pleased that Switzerland is also present. But let me start with these observations that, in fact, the challenge we're facing is that the world is running short of energy. And this financial crisis that we're witnessing now is actually interrelated with the energy and climate crisis in a way which is not very well appreciated or understood, I'm afraid. Let me start by being very politically incorrect, by giving some figures for CO2 emissions in China and how they have developed, or rather escalated over a rather short period of time. Prior to the climate negotiations in Copenhagen, we all heard that China was now an equally big emitter like the US with 20% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And actually, if you inspect the figure here below, where I've taken out from the global picture the Chinese emissions, you can see here how Chinese greenhouse gas emissions, which were as late as 2002, only at 3 gigatons, actually in just 6 or 7 years have doubled from 3 to 6 gigatons, going up from being about 10% of global emissions to 20% of global emissions. This doubling of China's CO2 emissions took place 25 years before all forecasts of the IPCC. And this explains some of the challenges that we are meeting. And in fact, because of the financial crisis and the decline in the American economy and the upswing again in the Chinese economy, when we take the figures that became available after Copenhagen, we can see that China's CO2 emissions have increased with further 2 gigatons and now account for 26% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Now actually, greenhouse gas emissions are just a mirror, because they mirror energy consumption. So what we are seeing here is this huge upswing in Asia's energy consumption, and it is an energy consumption which is continuing as China and other Asian countries are growing by 7, 8 or 10% per year. And what happens if you have an economy that grows by close to 10% per year? Well, what happens is that for it to double, it takes only about 9 to 10 years. So these are the growth rates which are now there in China, close to 10% per year, meaning that China will need to actually double its energy consumption just in the next 10 years, if they don't manage to decouple. And they have made very strong political decisions to try and decouple. They will try now to improve their energy productivity and grow more slowly with their energy. This was the decision this spring at the People's Congress. So now they will try to grow by 8, 9% and then only increase their energy consumption by 4 or 5%. But it still means that China will be, or will have doubled its energy consumption in less than 20 years from now. And until 2007, China was self-supplying with energy, but they don't have all those coal reserves anymore, as they used to have. Many of them have actually been consumed in this process. So China is desperately looking for ways to find more energy for its growing economy. That's why they are so active on renewables. That's also why they're so active on energy diplomacy. And actually, I had the great honor to work for 2 years in the China Council for Environment and Development with Chinese planners from their central planning unit, also with high-level civil servants from the Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Environment discussing these issues. And I can tell you they're very acutely aware of the need to be more resource efficient. But on the other hand, we're also talking about more than 1 billion people who have a right to grow and a right to improve their living conditions. So even if they are looking for energy efficiency, they are also looking to us in Europe and in the Annex I countries to deliver some of those new energy technologies that can help the world forward. Now, if we look at the way that the oil price has developed over the years, the international oil price, we can see that there have been peaks. We all know about the oil crisis in the 1970s, but you can see in this figure here also how the oil price peaked in 2005, 2006, and indeed this was because of the big Asian and Chinese demand for more energy in the market. Now, my argument is that the recession that we're experiencing now is actually very closely related to this upheating in the demand for energy. Because if we consider there what happened in the US with their subprime loans that we all heard triggered the financial crisis, yes, indeed, these were not very clever loans. There were many bad loans, there were many bad lenders, banks that didn't behave exactly as they should. But the essence of it was that these subprime loans were given at a time when interest rates were extremely low. But many of these loans then had inbuilt mechanisms that meant that interest rates would have to increase if inflation or other market developments caused the general market interest rate to increase. And this was exactly what happened in mid-2006, that inflation fears in the US caused an increase in the interest rate, and it was this increase in the interest rate which in turn triggered the higher payments for the subprime loans, which many of the lenders could not pay. And one reason for inflation is, of course, with the high oil prices, and especially in an economy like the American, where they have, in reality, almost no taxes on gasoline. These price increases on oil work their way very quickly through their economy. And more generally, if we consider the way that energy prices have an impact on inflation, you can see in this figure how much of the inflation developments that are explained by the developments in the energy price. You see here in this period, 2005-2006, how the increase in oil prices explains almost half of the inflationary development. And in fact, this is only the direct effect. There's also an indirect effect coming over food prices. So actually we are slightly above this. So with this I say that this energy supply crunch that we are facing is actually an underlying mechanism which is reinforcing many of the financial crisis mechanisms that we are facing today. And if we look into the future, what will be the future of energy prices? These are some forecasts coming from Denmark's Climate Commission, which has tried to look into the future under the assumption of continued economic growth in the emerging economies. And as you can see here, there will be very steep increases in oil prices in particular, but actually also in prices for coal and biofuels with the green line here. If the world is ambitious with climate policy in particular, there will be big increases because these price curves also do include some CO2 costs. But nevertheless, the message here is that we are entering a world of 9 billion people. We're also entering a world where energy is a much more scarce commodity, and one in which energy probably will absorb a much higher share of our consumer basket in the future. So this is why we can consider what can environmental tax reform do in this context. I'd like to make here one very strong point, which is that there is a big difference actually between energy taxes and energy prices, because where we are dealing with energy taxes, we can still keep the revenues in our national economies. and we can use these revenues to lower other taxes or do some other measures in our economies. This we are not able to do where we are facing higher energy prices, because there we are just losing our purchasing power to the oil-producing countries. So the challenge is maybe to be forward-looking and see what can we do with environmental tax reform before the energy prices really escalate. And there was a comprehensive debate in the 1990s over environmental tax reform, which learned us how to approach this, and I see also Switzerland with its CO2 tax has followed this debate carefully and seen the insights that came there. First of all, this issue of recycling the revenues to lower other taxes. Oliver Nordhaus said already nearly 20 years ago, he said this revenue recycling is what can make the tail of the dog begin to wag. There's a chance for a double dividend if we can use these environmental tax incomes to replace other distortionary taxes, and distortionary taxes are, for instance, high taxes on labor. And in particular, if we aim the revenues to reduce those payroll taxes that are being paid by employers and businesses, we can avoid also the inflationary effects, because if we reduce, so to say, at the source, there will not be this passover in the market. Now, this is not tax reforms, and we studied some of these in a European research project that I was the coordinator of. These countries made tax shifts of about 1% of GDP. It may not sound extremely impressive, but considering that, for instance, Switzerland nowadays has a 2% share of its GDP that relies on environmental taxes, if you did a 1% increase, it would actually be, you would be increasing your environment taxes with 50% as compared to where you are now. And this is where many of these countries were at that time. So I would say still it was an ambitious tax shift, and in this project, which is reported in this book from Oxford University Press with all the appropriate details, and I can just flag some results here, show that these taxes work very much as expected. They helped to reduce fuel demand in these countries, Denmark, Germany, Finland, also UK. Only Slovenia, which only renamed an existing energy tax into a CO2 tax, didn't get any impact from such a symbolic exercise. Sweden saw the largest decrease in its fuel demand. Part of this is a forward-looking exercise, but most of this exercise is actually very constrained, because these are historical figures. And in much of the economic modeling you will otherwise meet, people refer to models that only look forwards and where a lot of assumptions are involved. In this exercise, the models were calibrated against a real economic development, and in this way the impact of the tax could be disentangled. This was done by Cambridge Econometrics, which has a model called the E3ME model, which is used also by the European Commission and the British government and many others, which is quite an officially recognized macroeconometric model. Also, greenhouse gases were reduced in these countries, following very much the reduction in fuel demand, but for several countries there were also fuel shifting between carbon-intensive fuels to less carbon-intensive fuels that helped provide even higher greenhouse gas emissions than the fuel reductions that you saw before.